My name is Natasha Ward, and I'm 34 years old. Until a few weeks ago, I thought I understood my place in my family. I was wrong. When the lawyer slid a copy of the will across the desk, I actually laughed. It wasn't intentional, just a small, reflexive sound, the kind you make when something feels so absurd it can't possibly be real. I expected him to smile back, maybe tell me there had been a mistake, that this wasn't the final version. But he didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He just watched me carefully, like he was waiting for something to break. Everything was left to my stepbrother, the house I grew up in. My mother's vintage jewelry collection, the same pieces she used to take out one by one, telling me which ones would be mine someday. Their entire savings account. Even my father's ridiculous coin collection he'd been obsessively building since the late 80s. I got nothing. Not a sentimental item, not a letter, not even a mention beyond a single line buried near the end of the document, "Our biological daughter will be fine." That was it. I wasn't angry yet. I was just stunned, staring at the paper like it might rearrange itself if I looked long enough. And then it hit me hard and sharp. They meant it. They genuinely believed I didn't deserve anything. So here I am telling this story. Because I've always been the dependable one, the daughter who showed up, who handled things quietly, who didn't make waves. The kind of person who covers groceries, power bills, and prescriptions without announcing it because your parents are getting older and you assume that's just what you do. The kind of daughter who doesn't complain when the family makes excuses every Thanksgiving for a stepbrother who's been going through a rough patch for more than 10 years. The kind who hears Natasha, he just needs support, and bites her tongue instead of reminding everyone that support shouldn't mean endless handouts. Let me back up. I was 13 when my dad remarried. My mother had passed away when I was 9 after a long, miserable illness, and for a while it was just the two of us. Back then, he was a good dad. Not perfect, but present. We had pizza nights, movie marathons, and routines that made the house feel steady again. That all changed when Julia came into our lives. She had a son, Dylan, who was a year younger than me. From the moment they moved in, it felt like my dad decided we were going to be a happy blended family whether I felt it or not. Julia treated me like a polite guest in my own home. Dylan mostly ignored me unless he wanted something. At first, it was small things. My handheld game console disappeared and later showed up in Dylan's backpack. When I told my dad, he shrugged it off with "kids will be kids." My bike gained a new scratch every other week. The lock on my bedroom door, which I'd always been allowed to use, suddenly wasn't allowed anymore because, as Julia put it, this is everyone's home now. I learned quickly that speaking up made me the problem. Whenever I protested, I was starting trouble, and Dylan was doing his best, so I stopped pushing back. Fast forward 20 years. I moved out at 19, worked my way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, and eventually became a software engineer. I don't live extravagantly, but I've done well enough to be comfortable. Meanwhile, Dylan's life turned into a rotating cycle of short-lived business ideas that usually ended in debt excuses or him crashing on someone's couch. He's had more jobs than I can count, none of them lasting very long. At one point, he convinced my parents to co-sign on a loan so he could buy a new car for a rideshare business. He totaled it in 6 days. There was no insurance payout. They covered the cost. I wasn't even told until months later. And yet every time I visited, it felt like I was the one under scrutiny. "You work too much," Julia would say. "Don't you ever think about settling down, giving us grandchildren?" Meanwhile, Dylan couldn't even pay rent. I didn't argue. I thought maybe naively that one day they'd see the contrast for themselves. That one day they'd say, "Thank you, Natasha. You've been there for us." Instead, they wrote me out. For the last 3 years, I'd been quietly handling things. When my dad was laid off and their heating bill doubled one winter, I covered it. When Julia's prescription plan changed and her medication suddenly cost hundreds a month, I stepped in. When their car battery died on a Sunday morning, I sent money without asking for it back. I never told anyone about it. It just felt like the right thing to do. I think I started noticing the rot in our relationship about a year ago. I came over for dinner, and Julia had made my favorite dish roast chicken with lemon potatoes. I complimented it, told her it was great. She smiled and said almost casually, "Oh, I didn't make it for you." Dylan's been having a rough week. He was 32 at the time and had just been fired from a warehouse job for showing up late repeatedly. She added, "He's sensitive. He needs comfort food." I ate in silence. The worst part was that Dylan barely touched it. He said he wasn't hungry, left early to meet a friend, and knocked over his glass on the way out. I cleaned it up. No one noticed. It wasn't one big moment that broke me. It was death by 1,000 small cuts. Being overlooked. being expected to carry the weight without acknowledgement. And then came the will. That was the moment everything finally snapped into focus. Because once you see how easily you can be erased, you start to understand how little you were ever valued to begin with. After the will, I stopped pretending there was still confusion about where I stood. The document didn't create the problem, it simply put into writing what had already been true for years. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. For most of my adult life, I'd been the family's quiet safety net. Not the dramatic kind that swoops in and announces itself, but the invisible one stretched tight underneath everything. If something went wrong, I caught it before it hit the ground. If a bill went unpaid, I handled it. If a problem surfaced, I smoothed it over before it became an emergency. I did it without keeping score because I believed that was what love looked like when you grew up. I lived about 40 minutes away from my parents' house, close enough to be convenient, but far enough that they never dropped by unannounced. I visited once or twice a month, sometimes more if something came up. I brought groceries. I fixed small things around the house. I listened. I absorbed complaints. I made myself useful. Dylan, on the other hand, came and went like a storm system, loud, disruptive, and somehow never held accountable for the mess he left behind. He was always between things, between jobs, between apartments, between opportunities that never quite worked out. There was always an explanation, always a reason why this failure wasn't really his fault. The economy was bad. His boss was unfair. His business partner screwed him over. Julia repeated these excuses so often they became facts in her mind. My dad didn't argue. He just nodded and adjusted accordingly. The contrast between us was never subtle. I worked full-time, paid my own bills, planned my life carefully. Dylan borrowed money, missed deadlines, and burned bridges with alarming efficiency. But somehow I was the one constantly being evaluated, corrected, and advised. "You should relax more," Julia would say. "You're too serious. You're always working," my dad added once. "Life isn't just about responsibility." I remember biting back the urge to laugh. Responsibility seemed to be the only thing keeping their household functional. Every holiday followed the same pattern. Dylan arrived late, usually empty-handed, full of excuses and stories about whatever he was trying to launch next. Julia listened like he was pitching to investors. My dad asked careful, hopeful questions. I sat there passing dishes, refilling drinks, making sure everyone was comfortable. When Dylan needed help, money, a place to stay, someone to spot him for a few weeks, it was treated like an unfortunate but necessary investment. When I needed nothing, that somehow became a flaw. It didn't matter how much I contributed, because I didn't need them. I wasn't prioritized by them. Around that time, I'd started dating Ethan. He was steady in a way that felt unfamiliar at first. No grand gestures, no chaos, just presence. He noticed things I'd stopped noticing about myself. The way I flinched when my phone rang late at night. The way I apologized automatically, even when I hadn't done anything wrong. He never told me what to do with my family, but once after listening quietly to one of my stories, he said, "You know you're allowed to stop fixing things for people who won't even acknowledge you, right?" I brushed it off at the time. That felt like a betrayal of everything I'd been taught. What Ethan didn't know yet, what I barely understood myself, was that fixing things had become my role. Not because I was asked to, but because everyone expected me to, especially when things went wrong. And things went wrong often. 3 years before the will, my dad had been laid off unexpectedly. His company downsized, and at his age, finding new work wasn't easy. The winter that followed was brutal. Heating costs skyrocketed. One night, my dad mentioned casually that they might have to bundle up because the bill was higher than expected. He didn't ask outright, but he didn't have to. I transferred the money the next morning. A few months later, Julia's prescription coverage changed. Her medication went from affordable to impossible almost overnight. She called me in tears, saying she didn't know what they were going to do. I paid for it that month, then the next, then the one after that. It became routine. No discussion, no acknowledgement beyond a distracted thank you that faded quickly. The car battery incident happened on a Sunday morning. I was halfway through making coffee when my dad texted to say they were stranded in a grocery store parking lot. Tow truck, new battery, $400. I sent the money within minutes. Never asked for it back. I didn't tell anyone about these things. Not my friends, not Ethan. It felt private, almost sacred. They were my parents. Helping them felt like the bare minimum, not something worth praise. I think the first crack appeared the night of the roast chicken. Julia had invited me over for dinner, which wasn't unusual, but she sounded almost cheerful on the phone. When I arrived, the house smelled like lemon and garlic, my favorite combination. I complimented the food, genuinely touched that she'd made something I loved. She smiled, then said without hesitation, "Oh, I didn't make it for you. Dylan's been having a rough week." I remember waiting for her to add something, a joke, an afterthought, anything. She didn't. Dylan sat there scrolling on his phone, barely engaged. He picked at the food, said he wasn't hungry, and left early to meet a friend. His plate sat half-finished. His glass tipped over on the table, spilling water everywhere. I grabbed paper towels and cleaned it up automatically. No one commented. No one noticed. On the drive home that night, I felt something shift. Not anger, more like a quiet, unsettling awareness. A realization that I could disappear from that table and nothing would really change. I was useful, not essential. Reliable, not valued. The will didn't shock me because it was cruel. It shocked me because it was honest. And once you see the truth clearly, it's hard to unsee it. The health scare came in the early spring. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that made the news or sent anyone rushing across state lines, but enough to rattle my father and remind him that time wasn't as generous as it used to be. He'd had a dizzy spell at the hardware store, lost his balance, scared a cashier half to death. Julia called me afterward, her voice tight, insisting he was fine while simultaneously describing every symptom in unsettling detail. That was when they started talking about getting things in order. At least that's what I found out later. I wasn't included in those conversations. No one asked for my input or even informed me that estate planning was happening at all. I only learned about it because their lawyer and old family friend called me one afternoon and asked if I could come by his office to review some paperwork. He said it was just in case they needed an emergency power of attorney, a formality he assured me. I believed him. I took a long lunch break from work and drove over thinking I'd be in and out in 20 minutes. Instead, I sat across from him in a quiet office while he cleared his throat and opened a folder that changed everything. As he read through the will, my mind lagged behind his words. I kept waiting to hear my name, to hear something familiar, but it never came. Everything. Every asset, every account, every possession was designated to Dylan. When he finished, the room went silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too calm for what was happening. He nodded slowly. They were very clear. Julie was especially firm about providing for Dylan. I left without saying goodbye. For 3 days, I didn't call or text. I waited almost childishly for someone to reach out, to explain, to say there had been a misunderstanding or that they planned to talk to me about it soon. No one did. When I finally texted my dad and asked directly about the will, his response came a full day later. "You have a good job and a good life. Dylan needs this. You'll be fine." That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd taken from me. Just a neat transactional justification like they were dividing up furniture instead of family. Something in me shut down after that. I didn't argue. I didn't send a long message explaining everything I'd done for them over the years. I didn't cry or threaten or demand answers. I simply stopped. I stopped paying the power bill. Stopped refilling Julia's prescriptions. Stopped sending grocery gift cards when they forgot to shop. I figured if Dylan was the heir, maybe it was time he started acting like one. The first week passed quietly, then the second. By the third week, my phone buzzed. While I was sitting on my couch, watching a show with the volume low, it was a text from my dad. "Power is about to be shut off. Can you send money?" No greeting, no apology, just expectation. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed 4 words and hit send. "Ask your heir." I didn't hear back right away. In fact, I didn't hear back at all. Days went by without a single message. At first, I wondered if I'd gone too far. I imagined them sitting in the dark, bundled up in blankets. I imagined my dad coughing in the cold, Julia pacing the kitchen. Guilt crept in quietly the way it always did. But then I pictured Dylan on their couch, scrolling on his phone, completely unbothered. And the longer I sat with that image, the more something inside me hardened. The silence finally broke when Julia called. Not texted, called. It was the first time in months. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice thick with confusion and wounded pride. She said she didn't understand what was happening, that my father told her I refused to help, that I'd always been such a good daughter, and this wasn't like me. She never mentioned the will, not once. I deleted the voicemail. A week later, I got an email from Dylan. That alone was strange enough to make my stomach tighten. His messages were usually impulsive, sent in bursts, but this one was short and oddly casual. He said my parents were losing it, that the power had been shut off, that my dad wasn't feeling well. He wrote like we were on the same team, like this was a temporary misunderstanding. He ended by asking if I could chill out and send something to get them through the month. He promised he'd figure things out soon. I read it 3 times and felt nothing but a dull, heavy anger. Not once did he acknowledge the will. Not once did he thank me for everything I'd done before. It was as if my support had always been assumed, never earned. I didn't respond, and after that the calls started coming more frequently. Sometimes from my dad, sometimes from Julia. The tone shifted constantly, guilt, frustration, forced cheerfulness, but the message stayed the same. They needed me, and they still didn't see why I'd stopped helping. Then, one night, after weeks of ignoring the calls, there was a knock at my door. I checked the peephole and barely recognized my father. He looked older than I remembered, worn down, in a way that went beyond age. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. He cleared his throat and asked if we could talk. "You have 5 minutes," I said, stepping aside. He sat on the edge of my couch like someone afraid of overstaying his welcome. He started with apologies that weren't quite apologies, explanations that shifted responsibility elsewhere. Finally, he admitted that the will had been Julia's idea. "And you went along with it?" I asked. He didn't answer. That was when I understood that this wasn't just about money. It was about who they believed mattered when things got hard. And in that moment, sitting across from him in my own living room, I realized they had crossed a line they couldn't walk back from. After my father left that night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch long after the door closed behind him, replaying the conversation over and over, searching for something I might have missed, some hidden remorse, some signal that he truly understood what he'd done. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. He hadn't come to apologize. He'd come to stabilize the situation, to see if I could still be relied on to fix what was breaking. That realization hurt more than the will ever had. For days afterward, I lived in a strange in-between state. I went to work, answered emails, attended meetings, nodded at the right moments. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, I felt like I'd finally stepped out of a role I'd been playing my entire life. The good daughter, the reasonable one, the fallback plan. And once you stop playing a part, you start to see how dependent everyone else was on your performance. The calls kept coming. Sometimes my dad would leave voicemails that sounded almost rehearsed, talking about how hard things were, how stressed Julia was, how Dylan was trying. Other times, Julia would text short, clipped messages that alternated between concern and accusation. "This isn't like you. We don't understand why you're doing this. Family helps family." None of them asked how I was doing. None of them acknowledged why I'd pulled back. They spoke as if my silence had come out of nowhere, as if the will didn't exist, as if years of quiet support hadn't preceded this moment. Ethan noticed the change before I said anything. One evening, while we were eating dinner at my place, he asked me why my phone had been face down all night. I told him the truth. Not the polished version, not the softened one. I told him about the will, about the text from my dad, about the visit. He listened without interrupting, his expression calm but focused. When I finished, he said something simple. "You didn't abandon them. You just stopped rescuing them." That sentence stayed with me. A few days later, the silence worked. The power being out wasn't theoretical anymore. Food was running low. Julia's prescriptions hadn't been refilled. Dylan, it turned out, was less capable than everyone had assumed. He didn't know which bills were due when. He didn't know how to talk to customer service without getting angry. He didn't know where the insurance documents were kept. All the invisible work I'd been doing for years suddenly became very visible by its absence. That's when the tone changed. The calls turned sharper. Julia accused me of punishing them. My dad hinted that I was being selfish. Dylan sent another message, this time irritated, saying I was taking things too far. None of them seemed to grasp that the situation they were in wasn't caused by my silence, but by their dependence on it. And still no one apologized. One evening, after another string of missed calls, I stepped out onto my balcony and let the cool air hit my face. From up there, the city looked peaceful, distant, like a separate world. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd never allowed before. What if I didn't go back? Not dramatically, not with a speech or a confrontation. Just, what if I stayed quiet? The answer was terrifying and relieving all at once. I realized then that my silence wasn't cruelty. It was information. It showed them exactly how much I'd been holding together and how little they'd noticed. And whether they learned from it or not wasn't something I could control. That was the moment I stopped waiting for understanding. I didn't need them to agree with my decision anymore. I just needed to stand by it. Because once silence stops being a punishment and starts being a boundary, it changes everything. Once I stopped waiting for my family to understand, something shifted. Not all at once, and not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but slowly, like a muscle unclenching after being tight for too long. The constant tension I'd been carrying, anticipating their needs, bracing for the next request, preparing myself to smooth things over, started to fade. In its place was an unfamiliar quiet. I filled that quiet with work at first. It was the easiest place to hide. My job had always been the one area where effort led to predictable results, where responsibility was acknowledged instead of taken for granted. I took on extra projects, stayed late, kept my calendar full. But even there, the cracks were starting to show. I was exhausted in a way sleep didn't fix, burned out from years of carrying more than my share. Ethan saw it before I admitted it. One night, after listening to me complain about yet another last-minute request from my manager, he asked, "Have you ever thought about doing something for yourself instead of everyone else?" I laughed it off, but the idea stuck. I'd spent so long reacting to other people's needs that I didn't know what it meant to act on my own. A week later, I did something completely out of character. I requested time off. No laptop, no work email, no family visits. I rented a small cabin by the coast. Nothing fancy, just close enough to the water that I could hear the waves at night. The first day, I didn't know what to do with myself. I kept reaching for my phone out of habit, expecting a message that needed solving. There were none. By the second day, my breathing felt deeper. By the third, I slept through the night for the first time in months. I walked along the beach in the mornings, cooked simple meals, and started writing things down, not plans or lists, just thoughts. Half-formed sentences, questions I'd never let myself ask. Somewhere in the middle of that week, I realized I hadn't thought about Dylan in 2 days. I hadn't worried about the power bill or whether Julia had her medication or if my dad had remembered to eat. The absence of those thoughts felt strange at first, then freeing. When I got back home, I knew I couldn't keep living the way I had been. With Ethan's encouragement and more fear than I like to admit, I started exploring other options. Consulting, freelance work, something smaller, more flexible, built on my terms. A friend from college helped me get my first client. Then another. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. As I started building this new version of my life, my parents' situation quietly unraveled. The neighbor from their street, an older woman named Mrs. Lewis, I'd met a handful of times while dropping off groceries, called me one afternoon. She said she didn't want to interfere, but she was worried. She hadn't seen my dad in a few days. The lights were off at night. No one was coming or going. I thanked her, told her I'd keep it in mind, and hung up. I didn't go over. That choice haunted me more than I expected, but I also knew why I made it. If I showed up, everything would reset. I'd take over again. I'd fix things, and nothing would change. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I formalized my consulting work, set boundaries with clients, hired a part-time assistant. I even started looking at property listings, something I'd always told myself I'd do someday. The idea of owning something tangible, something that wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations, felt grounding. Meanwhile, my parents struggled. Julia fell one icy morning while trying to clear the front steps. Nothing life-threatening, but bad enough to land her in the hospital overnight. Dylan panicked, sent me a flurry of texts I didn't answer. Apparently no one could find the insurance documents. My dad was overwhelmed. Dylan didn't know what to do. And then, just like he always did when things got too hard, Dylan disappeared. I didn't find out right away. I found out because Mrs. Lewis called again, her voice tight with worry. She told me Julia had been taken to the emergency room and not long after Dylan left. She hadn't seen him since. The house was dark. My dad was alone. I sat there after the call ended, phone still in my hand, heart racing. For the first time, the situation crossed a line. This wasn't just favoritism or entitlement anymore. This was neglect. This was dangerous. And for the first time since everything began, I didn't feel guilt. I felt clarity. Because whatever happened next, I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was just a family misunderstanding. Something was seriously wrong, and soon I was going to find out just how deep it went. The knock on my office door came late in the afternoon, just as I was wrapping up a client call. It wasn't loud or aggressive. 3 quick taps, a pause, then one more hesitant, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure they should be there at all. I muted my microphone and glanced up at Grace, my assistant, who was already halfway out of her chair. She came back a minute later, lowering her voice. "It's a woman. She says she's your stepbrother's ex-girlfriend. She looks upset. Do you want me to send her away? For a second, I considered it. Dylan was a chapter I'd closed, or at least thought I had, but something about the way Grace said upset made my stomach tighten. I nodded. Have her wait in the conference room. I'll be right there. By the time I stepped inside, the woman was pacing. She looked like she hadn't slept mid-20s, maybe all sharp edges and nervous energy. Her jacket was frayed at the cuffs, her nail polish chipped. She stopped the moment she saw me. You're Natasha, she asked. Yes, and you're Rachel. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for days. I was with Dylan. Longer than I should have been. I didn't offer sympathy. I didn't need to. She sat down without waiting to be invited, then leaned forward, elbows on the table. I think your parents are in trouble, she said, and not just because Dylan left. I waited. She told me she'd stayed at my parents' house for a while after Dylan got kicked out of his last place. Julia had insisted it was temporary, just until he got back on his feet. Rachel said she tried to help at first. Bought groceries, cleaned, picked up prescriptions when she could. But Dylan wasn't just freeloading. He was doing things, quiet things, things he didn't want anyone to notice. She pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Dylan was sitting in what looked like a bank lobby holding a folder. The timestamp was from 3 months earlier. What am I looking at? I asked. Zoom in on the logo. I did. My chest tightened. It was the same private bank my parents used, the one I'd deposited into countless times when I was covering their bills. Rachel swallowed. I overheard him one night. He was bragging on the phone, saying he'd finally gotten access. He said he used Julia's ID, convinced the bank she gave permission, said the signature matched. My heart started pounding. You're saying he forged documents? She nodded. I didn't believe him at first. But then Julia started panicking. Money was missing. Thousands. Dylan told her she must have miscalculated. But I saw him transferring money into a crypto exchange the night before. Everything clicked at once. The desperation. The sudden silence. Dylan vanishing after Julia's fall. The house going dark. He hadn't just bailed, he'd taken what he could and run. Rachel reached into her jacket and pulled out a small envelope. I wasn't sure if I should give you this. I found it under the seat in Dylan's car the day I left. Inside was a copy of the will. My hands went cold as I scanned it. Same document, same wording. Dylan listed as sole beneficiary. But when I reached the last page, my breath caught. There were 2 signatures. Julia's was familiar. My father's wasn't. I'd seen my dad sign documents my entire life. This wasn't his handwriting, not even close. If this is fake, I said quietly, this isn't just betrayal, it's fraud. Rachel nodded. That's why I came here. I couldn't unsee it. After she left, I sat alone in the conference room, staring at the wall. The story I'd been telling myself, that I was the forgotten daughter, the one pushed aside, was suddenly too small. This wasn't just emotional neglect anymore. This was a crime. And without realizing it, Dylan had handed me the truth. That was the moment everything changed. Because I wasn't erased. I wasn't powerless. I was the one holding the evidence. And now I had a decision to make. I didn't confront anyone right away. Not my father, not Julia, and definitely not Dylan. I'd spent too many years reacting, too many years being pulled into crises that weren't of my making. This time I was going to move deliberately, quietly. If there was one thing I'd learned from watching Dylan, it was that chaos exposes itself eventually. All you have to do is stop shielding it. The first call I made was to a lawyer, not the family friend who'd handled the original will, but someone new, independent, sharp, and completely detached from our history. I laid everything out in plain terms, the will, the questionable signature, the missing money. Rachel's testimony and the timeline that suddenly made far too much sense. He listened without interrupting, asked a few pointed questions, and then said something that confirmed what I already knew. This isn't just an inheritance issue. If what you're describing is accurate, this could be elder financial abuse, forgery, and identity theft. Hearing it framed that way shifted something in me. For years, I'd minimized what was happening by calling it favoritism or entitlement. Those words were too soft for what Dylan had done. This wasn't about who got more love. This was about someone exploiting my parents when they were vulnerable. The lawyer told me what he needed: bank statements, communication records, proof of unauthorized access, anything that showed a pattern. I told him I could get it. And I did. I went back through years of transactions, every transfer I'd made to cover bills, every email where Julia thanked me for groceries or prescriptions, every text where my dad asked for help. I pulled bank records, cross-referenced dates, and compared them with the periods Rachel had mentioned. I traced Dylan's crypto activity using a few old contacts from my tech circle. He hadn't been careful. He never was. The trail was there if you knew how to look. While I was building the case, I made another move. I called Jenna, the real estate agent I'd known for years. I told her I was looking for a property near Ridgeview, the neighborhood where I grew up. She hesitated, reminding me that I'd once sworn I'd never live near that house again. I told her I'd changed my mind. The place we found was a duplex 6 blocks away. It needed work, but the price was right and the location was perfect. Close enough to be seen. Close enough to matter. I bought it, hired contractors, and started renovations. I didn't announce it to my family. I didn't need to. News traveled fast in that neighborhood. They'd notice soon enough. And they did. My car started appearing on the street again. Construction trucks came and went. The sign for my consulting business went up on the ground floor once the renovations were far enough along. I became a quiet presence in the background of their lives again, only this time I wasn't there to help. I was there to observe. I didn't go to the house, not once, but I saw my father standing on the porch more often, looking thinner, more uncertain. Julia moved slower. The curtains stayed closed. Dylan was nowhere to be seen, until the day he came back. I was outside the duplex helping unload furniture when I saw his car roll down the street. Same battered sedan, same uneven rumble. He parked a few houses away and got out clutching something under his arm. He didn't see me at first. When he did, his expression changed instantly: recognition, then fear. He turned away and started toward the house, walking faster. I let him go. That wasn't the moment to act. Not yet. I went back inside, closed the door, and made one last call to my lawyer. I have everything, I said. It's time. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he asked, "Are you ready for what comes next?" I looked out the window at the house I used to call home, at the life I'd outgrown, at the trap that had quietly taken shape without anyone realizing it. I felt calm, steady, certain. "Yes," I said, "I am." Because they thought I'd walked away. They thought I'd accepted being erased. What they didn't know was that while they were handing everything to the wrong person, I was positioning myself to make sure the truth finally caught up with him. And when it did, there would be no one left to clean up the mess for him. The first official move didn't come from me. It came in the form of a subpoena. My lawyer filed a formal inquiry into my parents' finances, requesting records from the private bank that had handled their accounts for years. With that filing, the bank was legally required to produce everything: transaction histories, access logs, call recordings, copies of identification used for account changes. The process was slow, methodical, and completely unforgiving. What came back was worse than I expected. The records showed multiple account accesses from Dylan's IP address, large withdrawals and transfers made during the exact window Rachel had described, funds rerouted into accounts that didn't belong to either of my parents, then quickly funneled into crypto exchanges, and buried in the voice logs was the detail that made my stomach turn a call, where Dylan impersonated Julia. He stumbled over her birth date, hesitated on security questions, and still got through because the agent recognized the voice. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't desperation. It was calculated. The bank moved quickly after that. Their legal department reached out to my father first, offering a private settlement before the matter escalated. They wanted to contain the damage. I made sure the letter was addressed to him, not Dylan, and I delivered it myself. It was the first time I'd stood on that porch in nearly 2 years. My father opened the door and froze when he saw me. For a moment, his face softened, like he was seeing something familiar and safe. Then his eyes dropped to the envelope in my hand, and the color drained from his face. "What is this?" he asked. "The truth," I said. "Read it carefully." He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, gripping the envelope like it might explode. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away, feeling strangely calm. 2 days later, Dylan showed up at my office. He didn't knock. He stormed in red-faced and breathing hard like he'd run the whole way. Grace tried to stop him, but I waved her off. I wanted this. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing us in. "You think you're clever," he snapped. "What did you do?" I leaned back in my chair, unbothered. I paid attention. "Something you've never been good at. You're trying to make me look like a criminal." I met his gaze. "You did that yourself." He laughed, sharp and bitter. "You think they'll believe you over me? I'm their son. You're just the one who quit." "You drained their accounts," I said. "You forged documents. You left them freezing while you ran off with their money." His fists clenched. "They gave me that money." "No," I said calmly. "They trusted you." I stood and walked around the desk, slow and deliberate. "You have 3 days," I told him. "Return what's left. Make a full statement clearing them of liability, or this goes to the authorities. His face went pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I didn't wait for an answer. I left him standing there alone with the consequences he'd been avoiding his entire life. The fallout was immediate. Dylan disappeared again, this time for good. He abandoned his car near a train station and vanished into someone else's spare room in another state. No one wanted to help him once legal trouble followed. The will was corrected within the week. A new document notarized and witnessed properly, fair, and transparent. No more secrets. My father called me afterward. His voice shook as he apologized not just for the will, but for everything. Julia called too. She cried. I didn't forgive them, not fully, but I listened. That weekend I went back to the house. We didn't talk about money or legal matters. We talked about ordinary things. Soup recipes, weather, old neighbors. It wasn't closure, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, the chaos was over. The strange thing about the end of a long fight is that it doesn't arrive with fireworks. There's no dramatic release, no rush of triumph that makes everything feel suddenly justified. It comes quietly, almost awkwardly, like a room going still after too much noise. That was how it felt when everything finally settled. Dylan was gone, not just physically, but permanently removed from the center of our lives. The investigation into the financial abuse remained open, though no one expected him to surface willingly. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to. For the first time, his choices were no longer my problem to manage or explain away. My parents changed, but not in the way movies like to promise. There was no overnight transformation, no sudden clarity that erased decades of patterns. What changed was smaller and more honest. My father spoke more carefully, like someone who finally understood the cost of silence. Julia stopped assuming. She asked before speaking. She thanked me for specific things, not just in general terms, and even when the gratitude came late, it mattered. I visited occasionally, not out of obligation, but by choice. Some days we talked easily. Other days, the past hovered between us like a fragile object none of us wanted to touch. That was fine. Healing didn't need to be rushed to be real. My own life kept expanding. The duplex renovation finished, and the space felt exactly the way I wanted it to, functional, warm, and mine. The consulting business grew steadily, not explosively, but in a way that felt sustainable. I hired another assistant, took on projects I actually cared about. On Saturdays, I hosted coding workshops for teenagers who reminded me of myself at that awkward, uncertain age trying to build something meaningful with limited tools and too much self-doubt. Ethan stayed. Quietly, constantly. He never asked me to choose between my family and myself. He never needed to. He just stood beside me while I did it on my own. Sometimes in the evenings, I'd sit on the porch of the duplex with a cup of coffee and watch the sun drop behind the rooftops of Ridgeview. I could still see the house I grew up in from there. It hadn't changed much. Same cracked path, same crooked fence. But it no longer felt like something I'd lost. Because here's what I learned. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't need speeches or ultimatums. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's success. Sometimes it's simply refusing to carry what was never yours to begin with. I didn't win because I got my share back. I won because I got my boundaries, my self-respect, my peace. And peace, I've learned, doesn't sound like applause. It sounds like nothing at all.